We are all influenced by the media we consume as young children. It helps form our fears, our sense of humor, our ideas of romance and adventure, and our worldview. My first exposure to Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol came at the young age of 4. Each generation has its own child friendly version of A Christmas Carol that introduces them to the story. For a lot of baby boomers, it was Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, which first aired in 1962. For young millennials, it was probably The Muppet Christmas Carol, which came out in theaters in 1992 and has been a classic ever since. I was born in 1992, so this could have been my first version. My introduction was actually Mickey's Christmas Carol. Like I said, I was 4 years old and I recorded Mickey's Christmas Carol off TV while I was at a Christmas party for my church. The next morning, I sat down and watched my very first version of the story. Mickey's Christmas Carol is only 25 minutes long, meaning it leaves out a lot of the book, and there are, of course, some things that are toned down for kids. But as a 4-year-old, I loved it, and to be honest, I still love it today. What I particularly remember about that first viewing is seeing Goofy as Jacob Marley haunting Scrooge and Willie the Giant as the Ghost of Christmas Present stomping through London. I was already becoming a lifelong fan. A couple years later, I was in first grade, and one of my classmates played Tiny Tim in a local theater production of A Christmas Carol. My whole class went to a daytime showing for a field trip, and I was hooked. My family went to see it again that Christmas as well, and we continued to every year for some time. Even with a fairly minimal set and small stage, I remember things like the outlandish fun of Fred's party and the bombastic nature of the Ghost of Christmas Present. If memory serves, it was a pretty faithful adaptation, tending to leave out the scenes that most adaptations leave out. We will be getting to those very shortly. I believe around that time I also first watched A Muppet Christmas Carol, and then I just started watching any version anytime it was on TV. I was in 4th grade the first time I actually read the novella, and by that point I had seen it represented on screen, stage, anything, many times over. There's not been a time in my life when I did not love A Christmas Carol, and rarely has a Christmas gone by where I didn't at least watch a version or two. So what is it that makes this story particularly special? Well, there are obviously things that appeal to me as an adult that I didn't think about as a child. There are other aspects of A Christmas Carol that are universal, regardless of time, place, or age of the reader. For one, it's a redemption story. Ebenezer Scrooge is an unpleasant man who lives a miserable life, and by the end of the story, he's turning things around. That's a universal theme. The redemption comes organically and naturally, well, at least in the book and the best adaptations. And it is genuinely heartwarming without being corny or trite. The book does a great job of making Scrooge a man who shuts the world out. He's not overtly malicious, but he turns his hate of the world inward. If you want to look at it in a religious sense, his sins are those of omission, not commission. The book goes out of its way to say that Scrooge is an honest businessman, and he always keeps his word. Dickens is really indicting the world's systems as a whole, not just individuals who are doing things illegally. Dickens is showing that Scrooge has a responsibility to do more than just the bare minimum. Second, there's the book's beautiful balance of darkness and light. This is a ghost story after all, and the scary scenes are eerie. However, the light scenes are beautifully basked in the glow of Christmas. Fred's party feels like a blast, as does Fezziwig's. We feel the joy of the Cratchit family, despite their meager means, and we rejoice with Scrooge at the end of the story when he finally gets it. As a child, I don't remember really being scared by any of the adaptations on TV or in film, but I appreciated the darkness of them, and they probably helped lead to my love of ghost stories and horror movies today. Admittedly, my local theater did have a single scare for 6-year-old me, as Jacob Marley would always exit with a huge explosion meant to make the audience jump. It definitely worked. Third, A Christmas Carol is just a beautifully written book. There's a reason that much of the dialogue is often adapted verbatim into film. It's iconic. Additionally, Dickens' prose is colorful and lovely, and even though this is harder to adapt, many versions are so in love with it that they try anyway. I can't say I blame them. So, what exactly is this podcast then? First and foremost, it's a history of the film and TV adaptations of the story. I'm going to try to cover every direct adaptation that exists from the sound era of film on. There are a few TV versions that are lost, which I'll talk about in the second episode. So sadly, I can't cover those, but if someone does dig them up, I will be the first one in line to watch. In addition to direct adaptations, I'm going to cover some other versions that are important modernizations, parodies, cartoons that did an episode with their existing characters. You get the idea. I want to talk about the history of each when I can. These episodes will mostly be analyses of the adaptations. I'll try my best to be objective, but I am the only one writing this podcast, so you will definitely be getting the analysis through my lens. I'll try to save the really heavy opinion stuff and personal stories for the end of the episode. I'm also going to bring in some guests on certain episodes, which will be a much more laid back format, and that will come after the main portion of the episode. I will be going mostly in chronological order, so it may take some time until we get to your favorite, but I think we need to go in chronological order to view these in a proper historical context. It helps us understand how the characters are played, what's left in and what's left out, and what message the screenwriter is trying to take from the book for their time. While most versions don't really add much to the events of the book, what they leave out can be quite telling indeed. Additionally, I've made up a scoreboard of 100 plot points and character descriptions from the novella, and I'll give each adaptation 1 point for every entry it includes. However, I don't believe that the version with the most points is automatically the best adaptation. The scoreboard is really just for fun. As with any adaptation of any book, the spirit is really what's important. If you haven't read the novella, I highly recommend it. I'll obviously be talking about it constantly, but I'm not going to be doing a full summary right here. It's a quick read, and as I said, it's a beautiful book. It's one of the most influential books ever written. Even if you've never read Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, you are familiar with it. My name is Collin Murr, and I've loved this story for as long as I can remember. I'm going to be taking a look at all of the movie and TV adaptations of A Christmas Carol that I can, because I love the story that much. This is Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Episode 1, Scrooge in the 1930s. The first stage adaptation of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol came just months after the book was written, and others soon followed. It has always been a popular work to adapt, with the earliest silent version coming as early as 1901. There were multiple silent versions of the story made, but we won't be starting with those. Dickens' tale is not one that lends itself to silent film very well. Dialogue is crucial to the story, and there's a lot of it in the book. Additionally, many of the silent films are lost, and the ones that do exist are quite short and often remove things. For example, there's one we only have part of, and it ends with Scrooge in the graveyard, so it just shows that he dies and we don't see Christmas morning. There might be a future episode of the podcast where I talk about them, but for now, we're going to skip them. The first full length sound adaptation of A Christmas Carol came in 1935 with director Henry Edwards' Scrooge. The film stars Seymour Hicks in the title role, and while his name may not be well known today, Hicks had been playing Scrooge for the better part of his adult life. Not only did he play the role in the 1913 silent film Scrooge, which was later re-released as Old Scrooge, but he had been playing the part on stage since the turn of the 20th century. For a little context, Charles Dickens only died the year before Hicks was born. Edwards' film does not have much of a lasting legacy, thanks in part to another version coming out just 3 years later. In 1938, MGM released A Christmas Carol, directed by Edward L. Marin and with Reginald Owen in the leading role. Even though there were multiple silent versions before this, and the most iconic version was still 13 years away, it is here in the 1930s that the legacy of A Christmas Carol on film really begins. 1935's Scrooge and 1938's A Christmas Carol are extremely flawed films, both as adaptations of Dickens' novella and just as films as a whole. However, what's interesting about them is that they are both flawed in such different ways. One film does not have a grasp on Scrooge's character at all, as he is far too unpleasant at the beginning of the film, and this makes his redemption hard to accept by the end. The other has a believable enough read on the character of Scrooge, but the screenplay makes some cuts and changes that leave the story kind of a mess. Roger Ebert once said of the 1922 silent horror classic Nosferatu, "Here is the story of Dracula before it was buried alive in cliches, jokes, TV skits, cartoons, and more than 30 other films." If you haven't seen Nosferatu, it is a wonderful movie. It came out 9 years before Bela Lugosi would play the Dracula everyone parodied and referenced, so director F.W. Murnau was free to adapt the source material as he saw fit, without feeling it would be compared to existing iconic films. What Ebert said about Nosferatu also applies to adaptations of A Christmas Carol. Sure, there were adaptations of the story on the stage, radio, silent films, etc., but there was not one iconic visual image the audience had in their minds. They wouldn't get this until 1951. Because of this, these two films do certain things that may seem bizarre in the present day, where we have seen endless versions of A Christmas Carol inspired by the 1951 film. While the structure of both 1930s films is similar to later ones, They both make choices that future feature length adaptations would never dare. The beginning of the book sees Scrooge rejecting three different aspects of Christmas, represented in Fred, the charity workers, and a boy singing Christmas carols. First, Scrooge rejects the family aspect of the holiday by coldly turning down his nephew Fred's invitation to Christmas dinner. He follows this by telling off two men collecting money for the poor, rejecting the charity of the season. After this, he scares away a young boy singing a Christmas carol, meaning he rejects the childlike wonder of Christmas as well. Pretty much every adaptation will include Fred and the charity workers, but many will leave out the boy singing a carol since he has less to do with the overall story and themes. Despite the films coming out just 3 years apart, Scrooge and A Christmas Carol couldn't be more different in tone. The opening scene of Scrooge shows us a dark city street in London and a somewhat out of tune group of musicians playing on it. Scrooge's office looks as cold and bleak as Dickens describes it in the opening paragraphs of his book. Some adaptations decide to start the story at nighttime, while others start during the day, as the book does, but seeing as how the book basically suggests it's so foggy in London that no one could see anything, both ways of doing it feel perfectly faithful. The 1938 film starts on a surprisingly cheery note, with happy music playing and the bustling streets of London looking like poverty's not an issue at all. This version is clearly attempting to be family friendly, but if you leave out all the dark stuff, it's just not the same story. If you make the world the story is set in look all happy and bright, the whole message about helping the poor and brightening a dark world is kind of lost. Instead of starting in Scrooge's office, we first focus on his nephew Fred, who slides on the ice and is kind to Bob Cratchit's sons. Even after this, Fred goes to Scrooge's office when Scrooge isn't there and he interacts with Bob Cratchit. We haven't even met Scrooge yet, and this is only a 70-minute film. Both films feature Scrooges that don't exactly work. Now, Scrooge is admittedly a very challenging character to pull off, as the actor has to take him from aloof and greedy miser to kind and giving man thanks to the events of a single night. Additionally, in a lot of films, Scrooge is portrayed as almost comedically evil at the beginning, almost as if he derives some sort of pleasure from treating people terribly. Now, in the book, a lot is left to readers' interpretations, but Dickens' Scrooge seems to be one who turns the anger and bitterness inward, not outward. What's more, Dickens goes out of his way to show that Scrooge isn't breaking any laws. Once again, it's showing that the system is flawed, not just as one man. In some ways, Seymour Hicks' Scrooge is pretty close to Dickens' character. He doesn't find pleasure in being cruel to anyone, and he's perpetually grumpy as opposed to displaying over the top anger. He clearly just wants to be left alone, but there is something about his performance that doesn't quite work. As a veteran of the stage and silent film, Hicks was probably used to playing this part in an over the top fashion, and you can see an even more over the top take in the 1913 silent film. He has toned it down a bit here, but he is so grumpy that he never really feels like an actual person. Additionally, he mumbles a lot, and it's often hard to make out what exactly he's saying. Hicks' Scrooge often seems lost and confused, never the kind of man who could get into a verbal sparring match with his nephew or some charity workers. There's a particularly odd scene where he's talking to Bob Cratchit about Cratchit feeding his family on a low salary, and Scrooge asks questions like, "Can I afford a wife?" and "Have I any children?" He's clearly trying to make a point, but Hicks asks the questions in such a way that it sounds like he doesn't know the answer.
Can I afford a wife?
Yes, sir.
Eh?
Uh, I mean, no, sir.
Have I any children?
Now, while it may sound like this is all just the symptoms of an older actor playing his iconic role a bit too late in his career, the most shocking thing of all is that these are all character choices. In the Christmas Past scene, we see Hicks playing the younger Scrooge, who is put together and has a commanding speaking voice. Admittedly, he does not look young like he is supposed to in these scenes. The actor was 64. But it does make you consider his performance in a whole new way. While Hicks' Scrooge is interesting, if not brilliant, Reginald Owen is frankly just bad. He's really wooden and cartoonishly evil, and we don't believe he would ever even consider changing. His performance is all bluster and jerky motion, and even his opening line is humbug. Owen is, admittedly, quite an odd choice for the role. He was barely 50, and when you look at the man out of costume, you don't really think Ebenezer Scrooge. In costume, he wears a hilariously bad bald cap, leaving very tiny tufts of hair, and it just looks ridiculous. There is a reason for the miscasting, though. Owen wasn't the original choice, as the film was supposed to star Lionel Barrymore. Barrymore played Scrooge annually on the radio, but he broke his hip before production of the film began and he had to exit. The performance from Owen isn't solely to blame for the bad portrayal in the 1938 film, though. The characterization of Scrooge overall is strange. For example, he has a considerable fire going in his office, even when he's not in, but he admonishes Bob Cratchit for putting more coal on his fire. Sure, you could say this is just showing Scrooge's hypocrisy, but the Scrooge of the book always cut back on things like this for financial reasons, not intentional cruelty. Take, for example, Dickens' line, "Darkness was cheap and Scrooge liked it." It is cruel, of course, to not let your employees stay warm, but there is a difference between flaunting one's hypocrisy and practicing what you preach. The book Scrooge does the latter. Owen Scrooge also pockets a bottle of wine that Fred leaves behind, which always struck me as an odd choice. There's no suggestion that Scrooge is an alcoholic, and the Scrooge of the present doesn't get enjoyment out of anything. So why is he taking a bottle of wine? Scrooge's nephew gets a lot of extra focus in the 1938 film, and Barry McKay does bring a lot of youthful charm and exuberance to the role. Giving Fred extra scenes in both the opening and Christmas present does ultimately harm the film. Again, it's only 70 minutes long, but McKay is fantastic in the role. He is kind to all and charming in a way that's still very human, and he sees the sadness in his uncle and really wants to help him. Still, it would be better played against a Scrooge who also felt like a human being. In the 1935 film, we have Robert Cochrane in the role of Fred, and he doesn't really bring much to it. His scene with Scrooge in the beginning feels rushed, like the actors are just kind of going through the motions. In that same vein, the charity workers scene in the 1935 film feels rushed. At least the filmmakers realized that this is one of the most important scenes of the story, and they did include it. It's just rushed through, no one's really selling those lines. While some adaptations do shorten the Fred scene, and others remove the caroling boy entirely, any adaptation that removes Scrooge rejecting the poor really undercuts the story and does not understand the message. For all their faults, both of these adaptations do include the charity workers. Now, in both of these films, we do get a version of Scrooge turning away the caroling boy. In the 1935 film, Scrooge is annoyed with the musicians on the street, and he mentions on more than one occasion that he is. And in the 1938 film, he turns away some carolers outside of the tavern where he has dinner. In the novella and most adaptations, we see Scrooge begrudgingly give Bob Cratchit all of Christmas Day off. He might not be happy about it, but he does do it, showing that he's a bad boss but not some unrepentant monster. The 1935 film plays out much like the book, with Cratchit going home merrily on his way. We see it in the 1938 film too, but then it's followed by a scene that makes Scrooge so comedically evil that it's hard to take anything the film does after it seriously. Here's how it plays out. Bob Cratchit joyfully leaves the counting house and sees some boys throwing snowballs. He joins them, makes one himself, and throws one at a man walking by, ruining his hat. Of course, to the surprise of absolutely no one watching, the man is Scrooge himself, who then fires Cratchit and refuses to give him a week's severance because it's the same price as a new hat. What's more, he then decides to take one more coin from Cratchit when he realizes that a hat actually costs more than what Cratchit makes in a week. Again, this version is trying to be family friendly and light, but this bit of comedy makes it really hard to watch. It's just embarrassing. I don't know if this played well in 1938, maybe it did, but it just makes Cratchit's situation even sadder and it makes Scrooge even worse. How did Cratchit not say this was his own boss or even consider that it could be? If the differences in these two adaptations haven't already been made clear, the scenes between Scrooge leaving the office and Scrooge arriving at home make them quite obvious. After the aforementioned firing in the 1938 film, Cratchit goes on his way as merrily as possible, buying Christmas dinner for his family. I get that he's trying to make things as nice as possible for them, but again, the scene of him being fired adds nothing, and there are no signs of poverty anywhere. Everything looks happy and well lit in this snapshot of Victorian London. The whole point of Dickens' book is that we need to be helping people year round. But we don't see anyone in this film any poorer than Bob Cratchit, and despite losing his job, he seems to be doing okay. Sure, we do see the charity workers asking Scrooge for money, but Scrooge never has to come face to face with the poverty they speak of. The way this adaptation bungles its message really makes the film crumble. There's a lot the 1935 film gets wrong, but the message about poverty is one thing it gets very right. When Scrooge walks home from his office, the streets look bleak. This also nicely builds up suspense to him seeing Jacob Marley. However, before we get home, we get an extended sequence of how people of all classes celebrate Christmas. Now, there is some physical comedy in this scene that does feel left over from the silent era, but if you can get past that, it's a really, really well done sequence. We see a lavish Christmas dinner presided over by the Lord Mayor of London, interspersed with shots of those less fortunate outside the gate, catching what glimpses of it they can. We see Bob Cratchit buying dinner for his family in this one too, but the film makes it clear that he's not the poorest of the poor. His situation is bad, and Scrooge is a bad boss, but there are people who have it far worse than him. While almost no version of A Christmas Carol can incorporate every scene from the book, there is one scene that seems to pop up in pretty much every cinematic version. Jacob Marley's face on the door knocker is one of those iconic images so tied up in the mythology of A Christmas Carol that you'll find it in even many unfaithful adaptations. There's a version we'll talk about in the future from 2001 that inexplicably has Marley's haunting happen in Scrooge's office. But when Scrooge gets home, there's Marley's face on the door knocker anyway. The Marley scenes in both the 1935 and 1938 films make absolutely baffling decisions, and both really bring their respective scenes down. In the book and many adaptations, the Marley scene is one of the most atmospheric in the whole story. Scrooge sees the face on the door knocker, quietly looks around his dark house, finally settles down, and encounters the ghost head on. It takes its time to unnerve us, and the best directors really nail this scene. The 1935 film does the build-up pretty well, as Scrooge pokes around his home before sitting down, only to be disturbed by a bell ringing. He looks out his window, only to see no one there. Then his door opens, and no one walks through. That's right, this film makes the choice to leave Marley's ghost fully invisible. Some suggest this is due to budget, while others have disagreed, but regardless, it just does not work in the finished form. Even worse, it's hampered with the totally absurd line from Marley: "Look well, Ebenezer Scrooge, for only you can see me." There's no one else in the room. This line is only for the audience. Previous silent versions did include Marley's ghost in physical form, and even if you do not have the budget for ghost effects, you could just have a human actor walk in, it'd be better than this. They could have at least given some creepy sound effects of chains rattling, they don't even do that. It's remarkably underwhelming. One thing about this scene that is interesting, possibly, is the uncredited voice of Marley. Internet Movie Database says the voice is performed by Claude Rains, who in 1935 would have been best known for playing, appropriately enough, the Invisible Man. It would be perfect casting, but the debate rages on to this day whether the voice is actually Rains or not. Since it is just an uncredited voice, and this is not a film on which production was heavily documented, we will likely never know if this is Rains. I don't claim to be an expert on these things, but I have seen a good number of Claude Rains films, so if you want my opinion, I don't think this is him. Rather, it sounds like someone trying to do an impression of him for the connection to the Invisible Man. At times, it does admittedly sound like Rains, specifically Rains doing the voice of an older man, which would make sense for Marley. But at other times, it just sounds absolutely nothing like Rains. Take a listen to the clip and see what you think.
I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it, link by link. Would you know the weight and length of the coil you bear yourself?
Now, in the aforementioned door knocker scene, we do see a brief glimpse of Marley's face, and that is decidedly not Claude Rains. But there's nothing there to suggest that the face belongs to the same actor doing the voice anyway, so it's probably a moot point. The 1938 film offers a completely different, but equally strange take on the Marley scene. The true creepiness of the Marley scene in the book doesn't just come from the fact that Scrooge is seeing the ghost of his old friend. That's part of it, sure, but he's all alone in the big, drafty house, and there's nothing he can do to escape it. He's alone in the world, and now he's alone with his wrongdoings. When the ghost enters, he's terrified, because now he has to face it all head on. But, for some reason, the 1938 film decides to cut the tension by adding other characters to the scene. Marley is played here by Hitchcock regular Leo J. Carroll, and we can thankfully see him this time, so 1 point in this film's column. And he looks impressively like his description in the book: glasses on the forehead, hair sticking out the back, head wrapped up, chains made of various financial items. However, the scene is completely ruined when Scrooge overhears a town crier calling the hour. Scrooge tells the town crier and the two men with him to come up to his room because there's an intruder. Marley, being a ghost and all, simply disappears, which leads the men to assume Scrooge is dealing with a different kind of spirit. I keep belaboring this point, but again, this film is a little over an hour long, and they're filling it with stuff like this. Again, I have to assume the filmmakers were trying to break up the eerie scenes with some comedy to make sure no kids in the audience are too scared. But again, it just completely undoes the scene. When the men go back to the street, Marley and Scrooge continue the scene as if nothing happened. The Ghost of Christmas Past is one of the most inconsistently depicted characters in all of fiction. No two versions of this character are really the same unless someone is doing a deliberate homage to an older version. And there's a good reason for this. Take a look at Dickens' description of the ghost in the book. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view, and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were, like those upper members, bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and, in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was, that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright clear jet of light, by which all of this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it with increasing steadiness, was not its strangest quality. For as its belt sparkled and glittered now in one part and now in another, and what was light one instant at another time was dark, so the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctness, being now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now with a pair of legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away. And in the very wonder of this, it would be itself again, succinct and clear as ever. Try showing that to a costume designer and see what they come back to you with. Needless to say, the ever-changing and contradictory form of this character is nearly impossible to depict in film, especially live-action film, so most versions don't even try. Many will keep some of the descriptions, such as white hair with youthful appearance and the extinguisher cap, but the portrayals can be absolutely anything. Men, women, children, ambiguous beings. You'll see all of them, I promise. In the 1935 film, we get nothing more than a bright outline. Marie Ney is credited as playing the ghost, but as for who does the obviously male voice, there are not even any Claude Rains-esque speculations. In the 1938 film, the ghost is played by the 21-year-old Anne Rutherford, who would famously play one of the O'Hara sisters in the following year's Gone with the Wind. And her appearance in this, being an MGM film and all, might make you think of Glinda the Good Witch from The Wizard of Oz, but that would actually come out the next year as well. The Christmas Past scenes are fascinating because you can learn a lot about an adaptation by which scenes are kept, which scenes are cut, and which scenes are changed. In the book, The Ghost of Christmas Past shows Scrooge 5 separate scenes. First, we have a scene of Scrooge all alone at school over Christmas break, getting lost in his books to forget about his father not wanting him home. In the book, we even see his literary characters coming to life, literally walking out of the book, spending time with Scrooge. The second scene is a year later at school, when Scrooge's sister, Fan, comes to get him because their father has softened. The third is a Christmas party held by Fezziwig, the man Scrooge apprentices for as a young man. This is followed by the breaking of Scrooge's engagement to his fiancée Belle. Finally, the ghost shows Scrooge the home life of Belle 7 years ago, showing she has the happiness Scrooge does not. At this point, Scrooge extinguishes the ghost with its cap, famously saying, "Haunt me no longer." While there are adaptations that include all 5 of these scenes, most do make some adjustments. In my opinion, the Fezziwig scene is the most necessary of these scenes, and the one that I would call absolutely necessary. You really need to show that Scrooge had an example of how to be a good boss. Second would be the childhood scene with his sister, followed by the breakup with Belle. The first childhood scene, and finally the scene of Belle's family. And you'll note that a lot of versions don't include that scene with Belle's family. Not really a scene that has Scrooge in it, he's just talked about, and it feels a little out of place to some people. It has its value, but I see why it's cut a lot of the time. While the lack of darkness is what makes the 1938 film fall apart, the choices made in the Christmas Past sequence are really what make the 1935 film crumble. We don't see Scrooge as a boy. We don't see Scrooge's sister or even hear anything about his family. We don't see Scrooge at Fezziwig's. Instead, we start with a middle-aged Scrooge rejecting a couple for an extension on a loan in the presence of Belle, who proceeds to break things off with him. She claims he didn't used to be so mean and unforgiving, but we never see any evidence of this. The film spends a lot of time on the atmosphere of London on Christmas Eve, and it's all the better for it. But to use the time you have for Christmas Past doing this, instead of showing how Scrooge used to be different, does nothing for your story. If you don't show Scrooge's childhood, we'll never understand how the solitary years at school hardened him to the world. And we'll never understand the genuine love he had for his sister and should be showing to his nephew who's still alive. If you don't show Fezziwig, we'll never see the perfect example of how to be a good boss and how to make the most of what you have, even if it's not a lot. What is the point of showing him turning away a couple for a loan? We know he does this kind of thing based on the opening scene. It doesn't help that the scene of Belle breaking things off with Scrooge is accompanied by a piece of score that sounds quite a bit like a somber version of I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy.
May you be happy, alone, in the life you've chosen. Bob.
It ruins the tension just a bit. After this, the ghost shows Scrooge the family Belle went on to have, and again, including this and not the other scenes just does not make sense. Of course, it's sad that his miserly ways led to him never experiencing a happy marriage or fatherhood. But all we see in these past scenes is Scrooge as he already is. There's no change in him, so what's the point of taking him into the past in the first place? The purpose of these scenes is to show him that in spite of challenges, there was a lot of light in his life and he rejected it. Again, I wish there was some account of how this film was made because these decisions are fascinating to me. Fascinatingly bad, but fascinating nonetheless. The 1938 film handles the past scenes considerably better. We see both scenes of Scrooge at school, and we see a scene of him working for Fezziwig. We don't see Fezziwig's party, which is strange, but we do see Fezziwig giving Scrooge and Dick Wilkins 2 days off for Christmas in addition to a nice bonus, so the gist of the character is still there. It is also notable that this is the rare adaptation that portrays Scrooge working for Fezziwig as a literal child and not a young adult, which is probably pretty accurate. Still, the past scenes here are pretty underwhelming, and this ghost really seems to outright tell Scrooge how terrible he is instead of letting him come to any realization on his own. Take, for example, the scene in the book where Scrooge observes Fezziwig and then thinks back to Bob Cratchit. "What is the matter?" asked the ghost. "Nothing particular," said Scrooge. "Something, I think," the ghost insisted. "No," said Scrooge, "no. I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all." That is the whole scene. Scrooge is a man still coming to terms with his emotions, so any more here would be disingenuous. Here's how the scene plays in the 1938 film.
What is the matter?
Nothing particular.
Something, I think.
Yes, there is. Old Fezziwig was very kind to me.
Yes, he was. But he's dead now. Perhaps you feel you'd like to repay his kindness to you.
Well,
You have a clerk, Bob Cratchit. Old Fezziwig would have been very happy if you had shown your gratitude to him by showing kindness to others. Your clerk, for instance.
business is business. I'm a good businessman.
This is a clear case of less is more. Having the spirit lecture Scrooge like she does in this movie does not add anything to the story, and it takes what is already an obvious scene and just hits us over the head with it. The Christmas Carol is unsubtle in its message, and I appreciate that, but I do not know why this film opted to put the moral realization of the scene in the mouth of the ghosts of Christmas past, only to have Scrooge fight back about his business acumen. Unlike the various interpretations of the Ghost of Christmas Past, there is a pretty commonly accepted look for the Ghost of Christmas Present. Dickens describes the ghost as such. It was clothed in one simple green robe, or mantle, bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eyes, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. The character's look is a reference to the traditional appearance of Father Christmas before the Americanized Santa Claus took over later in the 19th century. Dickens does not actually specify that the character has a beard, although the illustration by John Leech printed in the first edition of A Christmas Carol depicts him as having one, which fits the traditional Father Christmas image. Dickens also describes the character as a jolly giant, and while most adaptations may not depict him as a literal giant, they still make him large and imposing in one way or another. Again, as with Marley and the Christmas Past scenes, the 1935 film makes some bizarre choices with the depiction of this ghost. Thankfully, unlike the other ghosts, we do get an actual actor in costume playing the part. Australian actor Oscar Ashe plays Christmas Present, and while he does wear the traditional garb of the character, he has short hair, no beard, and a kind of growly, froggish voice. He does not exactly radiate Christmas spirit. The 1938 film gets a whole lot wrong, but it does get Christmas Present pretty right. Lionel Brand plays him in a gloriously over-the-top manner, and while he offers little of the somber tone seen in the book, it's still a warm, likable portrayal of the character. In the book, The Ghost of Christmas Present shows Scrooge an array of Christmas celebrations, from the streets of London to deep down underground in a mine, but the two most prominent scenes are at the Cratchit's home and Scrooge's nephew Fred's. Showing these two scenes is important for Scrooge to understand those in his inner circle. But the expanded scenes of countless others celebrating Christmas, whether rich or poor, are also necessary to Dickens' greater message. You'll always see the Cratchit scene, and you'll almost always see the Fred scene. But as for anything else, it varies wildly by adaptation. The 1935 film is set almost entirely at night, which at first feels like a deliberate choice to make Scrooge's redemption on the bright Christmas morning all the sweeter. However, it breaks the mold very briefly here by having a single scene of Bob Cratchit walking home from church with Tiny Tim, although it is dark when they arrive home for dinner. The film would never want to accidentally stumble into a meaningful stylistic choice. Cratchit in this film is played by Donald Calthrop, who does a passable job with the kindly family man nature of the character, but who goes way over the top with his facial expressions and attempt at humor. Some have pointed out the man's similarities to how Cratchit looked in the original John Leech illustrations, which is generous. He feels like he's acting in a silent comedy version of the story, which makes some sense since this film was only released a few years after the end of the silent era. It's just the Cratchit family scene should be heartwarming, but Calthrop's performance is so obnoxious that it distracts us from it. In the 1938 film, Cratchit is played by character actor Gene Lockhart, who you may know from Miracle on 34th Street, another Christmas movie. He's considerably stockier than the average portrayal of Cratchit, but he does okay. This Cratchit is played by his real-life wife, Kathleen, and they're obviously believable as a happily married couple. Gene does a good enough job of playing a man who's trying to appear happy around his family despite some inner turmoil. But there's really nothing remarkable about their performances either. They're perfectly fine. Before we get to the Cratchit home, though, we get a few additional scenes. First, we see the ghost stopping some very unfriendly interactions on the street with his horn of Christmas spirit. This is actually adapted from a very brief portion in the book, which involves him helping those waiting in line outside the baker's and making their Christmas a little merrier. But the film plays it for very silly comedy, like it does so many things. After that, we see Bob, Tiny Tim, Fred, and Fred's fiancée Bess in church, where the ghost convinces Scrooge that Fred deserves to be able to afford marriage. Alright, this is one of the parts of this movie that really bothers me. I've talked about some of the annoying parts, some of the silly parts. This might be the worst part of the movie. In the book, Fred is already married, but here they play up the drama a bit by having him engaged and in need of money. Here's the issue with this. Yes, Scrooge needs to be nicer to people and help them financially if he can. However, inserting a subplot like this goes against Dickens' message. Think back to the book and the Christmas past scenes. Belle breaks up with Scrooge because he's fallen in love with money. When they were poor, they were happy, and she says that neither of them cared. Now, Belle's not in this film, but this subplot feels like they didn't even read the book. If the message of the original book is love of money drives you from actual love, why does this movie have a subplot where people in love need money or their love will fade, which the ghost outright says? After this church service, Fred, Bess, Bob, and Tiny Tim meet up and chat for a bit. Again, sliding on the ice like in the opening scenes. We also then see the minister do it too because haha, isn't it funny? The scenes aren't really that terrible, but they really don't add anything either. They take up time where other scenes would have been better served. We see the Cratchits at their home and Fred and Bess at their party, so what's the purpose of this scene? The Cratchit Christmas scene will be done marvelously in some future installments. But again, the 1938 one does suffice. There are a few moments of note, though. First, at least for those with dirty minds, is when everyone is admiring the Christmas goose and Tiny Tim says,
I'd like to stroke it.
yeah, get your laughs in now, there aren't too many in this film. Second is the toast to Scrooge. In the book, Bob Cratchit humbly raises a toast to Scrooge, and his wife and children are disgusted by it, even Tiny Tim. Although they do eventually reluctantly drink to him because it's Christmas. Although Dickens does point out that Scrooge's spirit still hung over them for some time because they were so disgusted to drink his health. Now, in this movie, for some inexplicable reason, it's Mrs. Cratchit who raises the toast to Scrooge, and no one really seems disgusted by it. Alright, so maybe the filmmakers figured that a recently fired Bob Cratchit would never raise a toast to the man who fired him. But then why did they have Scrooge fire him in this movie? It's also notable that by this point in the 1938 film, Scrooge has basically completed his transformation. He begs Christmas Present not to leave the Cratchit home because he wants to hear Bob telling the children the story of Aladdin. That great Christmas story, Aladdin. After the scene at Fred's, he doesn't want to leave either, declaring joyously, I love Christmas. And then he laughs uproariously. Remember, this is the Scrooge just a few minutes ago who was angrily defending firing Bob Cratchit to the last ghost. Where's the character development? Again, the Fred and the Cratchit family scenes are the centerpieces of the Christmas Present scenes in the book. But there is so much more that is often not covered in the films. There's one interesting scene where Scrooge and the ghost talk about how bakeries need to be open on Sundays. We're going to talk about that part in a future installment, so we'll put a pin in that for now. We get the sense that the ghost shows Scrooge pretty much every Christmas around the world, and we get a few specific scenes of miners and sailors celebrating. Here's one passage I've always loved. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. Their spirits stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. On foreign lands, and they were close at home. By struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, and jail. In misery's every refuge, where vain man and his little brief authority had not made fast the door, and barred the spirit out. He left his blessing, and taught Scrooge his precepts. Many adaptations will add something to these present scenes beyond just Fred and the Cratchits, and it's fascinating to look at how wildly varied these additional scenes can be. The 1935 film gives us a lovely little sequence that really shows why the atmosphere is this film's greatest strength. Tiny Tim starts singing Hark the Herald Angels Sing. We transition into a choir singing it. Then we pan down the street to see various silhouettes in the windows celebrating Christmas. Then we're flying over the streets of London, lights lit everywhere on this Christmas night. After this, we're out to sea as we see various sailors celebrating Christmas until we're back in London at Fred's party. Like the scenes of the rich and poor Christmases earlier in the 1935 film, it shows this story existing in a grand world. Alternatively, the 1938 film never seems to leave the few streets it takes place on, and it suffers for that. One of the most memorable scenes from the book is the exit of the Ghost of Christmas Present. Since he only lives for one day, he noticeably ages as the day goes on. A lot of adaptations do leave this aspect of the character out, including these two. These two also leave out the children Ignorance and Want, who the ghost warns Scrooge to beware of, particularly Ignorance. It's a deeply unsettling scene, and it's followed by the ghost and the two children disappearing at the stroke of midnight. This leaves Scrooge abandoned and scared, perfect for the arrival of the Ghost of Christmas yet to come. However, since these two films leave out Ignorance and Want, They end the present sequence in ways that are not quite as effective. The 1935 film has a slightly surreal sequence where the camera pans down to the fire at Fred's party. Christmas Present laughs and laughs, and Scrooge wakes up in his bed to meet the third ghost. The 1938 film has Scrooge scream about how much he loves Christmas before we see him in his bed having happy dreams. Then, all of a sudden, he awakes in a strange wood that appears to be a leftover set from Macbeth. I get they wanted him to meet the ghosts of Christmas yet to come somewhere spooky. But what is the purpose of this set? They don't do anything here. Why didn't they just have the ghost leave Scrooge in the middle of the city? They immediately leave the wood and go back to the city anyway. The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come has the potential to be the creepiest or most unintentionally hilarious part of any adaptation, and we'll see some where it's the former and others where it's the latter. Dickens describes the ghost as such: a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. But for this, it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. The Christmas Yet to Come scenes in the book are moody, somber, and atmospheric, and they can be tough to bring to screen effectively. Still, a lot of adaptations bring something unique to the table without making them melodramatic or silly. Keeping with the minimalism of the rest of the film, the 1935 Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come is simply portrayed as a shadow that encompasses Scrooge. As with Christmas Past, it may not be remarkable, but it suffices. In the 1938 film, on the other hand, we get a cloaked figure like described in the book, but there's just nothing otherworldly about it. He walks like a human being, he's lit far too brightly, and when he sticks out his hand to direct Scrooge, it just looks like a human hand. Like with the rest of the film, it's just too bright and cheerful. Dickens' tale balances that dark and light brilliantly, and this film really doesn't. So in the book, The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come shows Scrooge 6 prominent scenes. We get businessmen at the exchange talking about a mysterious man's death, a junk man buying things people stole from the dead man, a dead body covered with a sheet, a husband and wife who were in debt to the dead man celebrating his death, the Cratchits mourning Tiny Tim, and finally a graveyard. Unless the adaptations are doing something entirely different, they have to do the graveyard scene, and almost all of them will do the Cratchit scene. Additionally, most every version will do some variation on the men at the exchange talking about Scrooge, and you'll see the junk man scene fairly often. You'll see the body covered by a sheet in a few versions, but almost no version does a variation on the scene with the couple, likely because this is their only scene in the book. I'm going to talk more about this scene when we get to Scrooge 1970, the musical version, because it has a really interesting take on this scene. Now, both of the 1930s adaptations paced their Christmas Yet to Come scenes strangely. The 1935 film does have all of the scenes save for the happy couple, but it spends all of 5 minutes on the Junkman scene. It is creepily shot and acted, so it's not ineffective, but it is just languidly paced. The Cratchit scene here is quite effective, and I'm going to give Donald Calthrop some credit here because he's quite good as Bob in these scenes. He tries not to break down in tears in front of his family, but then he goes to the room where Tiny Tim's body is and he cries over him. Most adaptations don't go as far as showing the child's body, so it's fascinating that we get it in such an early adaptation. Again, the Roger Ebert Nosferatu quote, this adaptation is doing things future adaptations would not dare. It fits with the somber tone of the film, too. It's a really effective scene. There's one thing that ruins it, though, and that is Scrooge saying, "Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God." This is the rare cringy line from the book, but at least in the book, it's said by Dickens' narrator. Putting it in Scrooge's mouth makes it even worse. Even at Scrooge's best, this sounds nothing like the way he talks. While the 1935 film spends 5 minutes on the Junkman scene, the entirety of the Christmas Yet to Come scenes in the 1938 film last only 7 minutes. This is the same film that spent minutes on small talk outside of a church, but it doesn't have time for Christmas Yet to Come. And as you're going to see in some future installments, Christmas Yet to Come really gets the short end of the stick a lot of times, and this is the earliest version where that's the case. It cuts the Junkman scene entirely, showing us only the businessmen talking, the man on the bed, the Cratchits, and then the graveyard. It's all very rushed, and there doesn't really feel like there's any emotion in it. The name Ebenezer is also written on the tombstone in a strange way that makes the first letter look like an A. I suppose this could suggest that so few people cared about him that no one even cared about the obvious typo on his tombstone, but that's probably not the case. While in the 1935 film, Seymour Hicks does a passable job with his graveyard scene. Reginald Owen in the 1938 one just continues to overplay the role, never once showing a convincing emotion. He never really acts like he's being confronted with his own death. There's a lot that goes into playing a great Scrooge, but one of the most important factors is how they play the Christmas morning scene. It's easy to go way over the top here, and the worst performances take it so far that it completely takes you out of the movie. There needs to be joy, even unbridled joy, and a little bit of silliness sometimes, but it's tough to play that convincingly on screen. The problem with the 1935 Christmas morning scenes does not really lie with Seymour Hicks' performance at all. Okay, he's still a little mumbly, but he actually does pretty well without taking it too far over the top. The true happiness with which he talks about Tiny Tim still being alive is absolutely lovely, and his best moment in the film. The Christmas morning scenes here are brought down by the film's debt to the silent era. We do see her talk in the Junkman scene, but the rest of the film mostly plays Scrooge's charwoman, Mrs. Dilber, as a silent character who only exists to react to Scrooge's Christmas morning delight with befuddled reactions. I understand the desire to give someone Scrooge can talk to in these scenes, but in the book, he's so delighted by everything, he's talking to himself. But it continues after he leaves the house, too. When Scrooge goes to buy a turkey from the poulterer, he throws a snowball at the window. The poulterer slams his window shut, and it pours down snow on Scrooge. Like with the rest of the comedy here, this might have played great in 1935, but it feels pretty dated now. Thankfully, we do get all the heartwarming scenes from the book as they should play out. Scrooge sends a turkey to the Cratchits. He makes a large pledge to the charity workers. He visits his nephew Fred for Christmas dinner, makes amends, and he gives Cratchit a raise and promises to help his family. There aren't any bizarre decisions that would make you exit the theater scratching your head, because what kind of Christmas Carol adaptation would want to leave you on a note of confusion? Oh yeah, the 1938 one. Unlike the book, the 1938 film ends the story on Christmas Day instead of the day after. This is very, very common in adaptations. It's just one of those changes that wraps the story up tidily on Christmas Day. You get that nice Christmas feeling. You can debate whether or not it's a better place to end it. I, for one, don't really like this change. I'm going to get into that a bit more, but it never really ruins it either. I just don't like that it has Scrooge interrupting someone's Christmas dinner to say he's changed. It kind of makes it feel like it's all about him. I like him sending the turkey anonymously and then the next day showing up at the office a changed man. That's a more considerate take on his part. Although, in this film, Scrooge has fired Bob Cratchit, so he would need to go to his house anyway, so I suppose it's okay. He goes to Fred's first to tell his fiancée a secret, and his fiancée tells the secret to Fred. Then he invites Fred and his fiancée to the Cratchits because this movie wants to have a scene with everybody all in one place. While he's at Fred's, there's a hilariously bad line that was clearly dubbed in post by someone not even trying to hide their American accent.
This is my Uncle Scrooge.
How do you do?
Fred, you dog, who is this fellow? Not your uncle, I'll be bound. He'd never have a smile like that.
It's so pointless, and I don't know why that's in here. It sounds awful. Anyway, Scrooge goes to the Cratchits with dinner and toys for the children and Fred and Bess. And he, of course, rehires Bob and raises his salary. Great, wonderful. He also hires Fred to be his partner in the business and take Jacob Marley's old place. Bob Cratchit, who has been working tirelessly for Scrooge for ages, only gets a raise. But Fred, his nephew, immediately jumps the line and becomes partner. There was no foreshadowing for this except that Fred needed money, and there was no suggestion that this was even Fred's line of work. I guess the moral of the story is God bless us everyone, but especially if we're related to the protagonist. While very few people will consider either of these films the definitive version of Dickens' tale, they are both quite interesting as early adaptations. The 1938 version has undeniably been seen by more people, as it was seen frequently on TV from the 1960s onward. It's also a Christmas-time favorite of Turner Classic Movies. The same cannot be said of the 1935 film. Most existing prints look pretty bad, and until recently there wasn't even a clear version readily available. There's also a 1-hour cut of the film which is poorly edited and makes even more inexcusable omissions, such as the charity workers and Fred's party. It's very odd for Christmas Present to say, "Come now and see how others keep Christmas," only for the film to give us the beginning of Hark the Herald Angels Sing, followed by Scrooge waking up in bed. The 1938 one, all the prints look really clear, easy to find. It's a quick watch. It's intriguing, if nothing else. As I mentioned, I'll be scoring each adaptation on a scoreboard of 100 important moments. Scrooge 1935 scores an impressive 60.5. It really falls apart in the past sequences, but so much of it is faithful beyond that. It scores some points that plenty of other adaptations don't in columns such as Scrooge seeing the lighthouse workers and sailors celebrating Christmas during Christmas Present, Bob crying over Tiny Tim's body in Christmas Yet to Come, and finally on Christmas morning, Scrooge struggling to shave because he's so happy. The 1938 film score does show why this scoreboard cannot be the only judge of adaptation accuracy. It scores just 10 points fewer at 50.5 because it does have a lot of plot beats from the book. However, this scoreboard does not really account for tone, and this film really does not understand the tone of the book. There aren't too many unique plot points that this one keeps that others don't. There is that brief scene where we see Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Present walking the streets, and Christmas Present briefly breaks up a fight between two men with his torch. A lot of cheaper versions don't really show the streets being wide open. We do get a little bit of it here at least, which is nice to show it existing in a slightly bigger world. I wish there was more of it. Although it doesn't lose as many scenes during Christmas Past as the 1935 film, this one does leave out a whole lot of the darkness in the past. And I'm not giving any points to a scene where the Ghost of Christmas Past says, I haven't even shown you the black years of your life yet, because we don't see them. They're just hinted at with a throwaway piece of dialogue. Not getting points for that one, sorry. So, those are the first two sound film adaptations of A Christmas Carol from 1935 and 1938. I hinted a bit at the definitive version of the tale that came out in 1951, but we're going to wait a week for that one because next week we're going to be talking about the early TV adaptations. There were a fair number of TV adaptations in the 40s and 50s, but there are four that remain from 1949 to 1959, two of them musicals. So that's next week. Stick around for the rest of this episode where I'll share some notes and some personal thoughts and stories about these two adaptations on Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. So that is the first episode of my podcast, talking about two early sound adaptations of A Christmas Carol. With many of these, I will be taking just a single adaptation per episode. It really just depends. But I think with these early two, it's good to have that compare-contrast model, because you really see how wildly different these two films end up being. Even though they're both 1930s adaptations, both fairly short, and obviously both using the same source material, and they create really, really different finished products. Again, both deeply flawed. Neither is a great film. But they're so interesting because there was not that definitive version yet. We were still 13 years away from that. So, with these two, I really wanted to include them in the same episode. Like I said, next week's going to be TV adaptations, but when we get to the 1951 film, for sure, that's going to be its own episode. Scrooge, the musical 1970. A lot of the cinematic versions will be getting a full episode on their own, because those are the ones I'll have the most to say about. So I first saw the 1935 film about a decade ago, 9 years ago to be exact. I was doing a series for my blog. It was about the 10 most famous adaptations of A Christmas Carol, and I wanted to review mostly straightforward adaptations. I did have Scrooged in there, but for the most part, it was straight adaptations of A Christmas Carol, and I started with this one, the 1935 film. Even then, there was not a good-looking print of this film, and what I watched was very blurry. There's many, many prints available of this, and most really don't look good. Be very careful when searching this one out. Don't watch the colorized version. Don't watch the version that cuts about 17 minutes of film. As of this recording, YouTube has a version that's free with ads. That's the best print of this I've ever seen. There's still some moments that aren't great, but whatever restoration they did, it looks phenomenal compared to what I'd seen before. So, yeah, I really recommend that version specifically. And I really do think this is a movie that's very interesting to check out. Again, the past sequences really do not work. But the atmosphere of this film, that beautiful scene at the beginning when we see the contrast of the rich and poor Christmas, that's the whole book. That's the message of the book right there, and it's just incredible. And then, of course, that beautiful scene flying over London in Christmas Present. It really nails those two scenes, those aspects of the book. And it has this dark, moody atmosphere throughout, minus that one little piece of score that always cracks me up. And yeah, there's some performances that are interesting at points. Probably not one great performance throughout, but Seymour Hicks has his moments. Donald Calthrop has his moments by the end. Plus, you can see a young Maurice Evans from Rosemary's Baby and Planet of the Apes as a man that Scrooge turns away for a loan. It's a very interesting movie. The 1938 film, I think I first saw in high school, and I believe for a while I mixed this up in my head with the 1951 film Scrooge, which I knew was the definitive version for so many people, and I was wondering why people were praising this film so much that I thought was just kind of fine. I didn't really ever love the 1938 film, but I used to like it more than I do now, to be honest. It's kind of gone down in my estimation. I used to think, well, it has this consistent tone. It kind of works. It's light and cheery. And that really bugs me now. I really do not care for this version. I think it's very flawed at a level that makes it not work as an adaptation. The 1935 film, the Christmas past scenes really do kind of ruin it, but it gets the message of the story beyond that. The 1938 film it's trying to be all bright and cheery. And I get it. We were coming out of a depression. It was 1938, trying to think of the future. The 50s and 40s versions are even worse with this, with we're getting people presents, a booming economy. But the 38 film really doesn't have any of the darkness of the book, and that's why it doesn't work. I think even Anne Rutherford, the actress who played Christmas Past, said it was something of a B film. No one really cared that much about it, and yeah, it shows. The 1938 film does have a really, really great portrayal of Fred. I think there's probably one, if memory serves, later on that's even better. There's one better portrayal coming, but Barry McKay is really, really good here. He's the standout. Just so, so charming and likable. That twinkle in his eye, and he interacts with everyone really well. I get why they wanted to cast him when they expanded the part, because, yeah, he's really likable. I don't know why they gave him so much more to do, except Scrooge isn't really the movie star looking type, so they wanted to have some more movie star looking types in this. But I mean, if you're going to have to do that, which I wish they didn't, but they cast someone good, so I'm glad it has that at least. If you do check it out, leave me a comment, tell me what you think. I know there are people who still say, hey, the 1938 film's the definitive one. I grew up with it. I get it. The one we grew up with, the one we first watched as a kid, that's going to have a big influence on our interpretation of the story, how we view it in our head when we read it. And we're probably going to love that first version we saw no matter what it was. I'm sure people, including myself, will pick holes in Mickey's Christmas Carol. There's all kinds of flaws, but it was my first version, and I love it. As for the 1935 version, I've really not heard anyone argue it's the definitive version, and it's not. That's fair. I've read the comments on YouTube. No one's making an argument for it being definitive. But again, it's so interesting. It's really not like any other version. It's very unique. Let me know what you think about these versions. Always interested to hear from people who love these versions because this story's been told so many times and everyone's going to have their favorites. Next week, we're going to be talking about 4 versions from 1949 to 1959. There are 2 25-minute versions, and then there are 2 musical versions. One's called A Christmas Carol. One is called The Stingiest Man in Town. If that name's familiar, it was remade in the 70s as a cartoon by the Christmas duo Rankin and Bass. That version we'll get to in the future because that was in the 70s. But next week, it's 4 versions of A Christmas Carol. 2 pretty short ones, 2 musicals. So yeah, stay tuned for that. And thank you for listening to Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. We will see you next time. Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast is written, edited, and hosted by Collin Murr. Theme music is Christmas Day by T.R.G. Banks, and T.R.G. Banks' Snowfall is also used for interstitial music. Clips in this episode are from Scrooge 1935 and A Christmas Carol 1938. The Roger Ebert Nosferatu quote is from his archived review on rogerebert.com. Leaving a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing on YouTube will be a big help to me. I'll be back next Wednesday with another episode of Scrooge, a Christmas Carol podcast. Until then, make sure to live in the past, the present, and the future, and ensure that the spirits of all three strive within you.